Es spricht der Führer.
The United States played a significant and commonly overlooked role in the Holocaust. When I say this, I don't just mean the United States ignored the Holocaust under the Roosevelt administration, despite clear evidence of mass killing in Nazi Germany, but instead something much more disturbing. This is rarely ever discussed now, but in the early 20th century, America was a global leader in the eugenics movement, with teenagers, politicians, and even Supreme Court justices openly discussing the idea of sterilizing the unfit, not as a last resort to a serious genetic or medical issue, for example, but as though it were simply a common solution to a common problem. Let's be clear, this was not some type of fanatical, radicalized group running this movement. It was actually popular nationwide. This was California, this was Virginia, this was the United States. So let's talk about what eugenics actually is and how tightly woven into American culture it once was. By the time we reach the end of the video, it will be clear as day how this unspoken chapter of American history inspired the tactics of perhaps the most popular genocide in modern history. It always helps to have an upfront definition of what we're talking about. Eugenics is the belief that humans can be improved over time by controlling who is and who is not allowed to have children. What this means in practice is that people with good traits like high intellect or height should have more children, while people with bad traits like hereditary illnesses, mental disabilities like Down syndrome, or impulsive behavior should have fewer or no children, sometimes being forcefully sterilized without their consent.
Most of these losses, too, could be avoided by early use of preventive measures and better medical care. And various diseases which attack growing children and hamper their normal development. Their childhood is robbed of happiness and blighted by physical disaster.
This may sound a bit dystopian, especially if you're new to the topic of eugenics, but the movement arose and stuck around in the US due to a few factors. Firstly, many things working in tandem contributed to the United States embracing eugenics, including but not limited to misapplied Darwinism, flawed science that viewed heredity as a major factor when it came to crime and illness, and progressive era reformers looking to improve society by any means necessary. Something like eugenics doesn't just pop up on a whim. Secondly, eugenics has had a historical tendency and oftentimes an objective to justify racism, forced sterilization, segregation, and many other things I don't have time to cover in this video alone.
And so, black codes were established that declared slaves were not persons, but property. White men had established a moral system to meet their needs. At the heart of it was a belief in the Negro's natural inferiority.
And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the eugenics movement was not some niche or fringe set of beliefs by any means. Rather, it was supported by respected scientists, Ivy League schools like Yale and Harvard, and perpetuated by large institutions like the Carnegie Institution. Understand that discussion and trust in eugenics as a simple, logical truth was prevalent, and it showed up in textbooks, marriage and immigration laws, and courthouses. The people that supported this ideology genuinely believed that doing so was wise and for the betterment of everyone. Supporting the eugenics movement was seen as progressive, which is why you shouldn't be too shocked to hear that Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, along with Alexander Graham Bell, J.H. Kellogg, Winston Churchill, Margaret Sanger, and even Helen Keller were all in support of eugenics. A landmark starting point is 1907, when Indiana became the first state to pass legislation allowing forced sterilization in public institutions. As mentioned before, this included the disabled, mentally ill, or whoever was simply labeled unfit for regular society. My words alone are insufficient. Look at this 1922 draft for a new sterilization law I found, written by American educator Harry Laughlin, and entitled Model Eugenical Sterilization Laws. It reads, "An act to prevent the procreation of persons socially inadequate from defective inheritance, by authorizing and providing for the eugenical sterilization of certain potential parents carrying degenerate hereditary qualities." The draft even defines each pertinent term. For example, a socially inadequate person is one who, by his or her own effort, regardless of etiology or prognosis, fails chronically, in comparison with normal persons, to maintain himself or herself as a useful member of the organized social life of the state. As you've maybe figured out by now, eugenics is mostly concerned with the genetically unwell, so the definition makes exceptions for the very young, very elderly, curably injured, etc.
Many old people are victims of accidents that cripple or chronic diseases that bring handicaps, impairments, and unhappiness.
Laughlin's draft for a sterilization law is just one of many, although it was very influential. By the mid-1920s, over a dozen states passed laws with language like this, and the now much forgotten Buck v. Bell case was pointed to as justification for such laws. Buck v. Bell was a 1927 Supreme Court case that upheld sterilization of the aforementioned socially inadequate persons. In other words, sterilization, often forced, was declared entirely legal after the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 on the issue. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously wrote in his opinion, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Remembering that eugenics was not at all a taboo subject at this time, consider that the term imbecile was not the insult we perceive it as today, but instead a scientific term used to describe levels of mental inability, along with words like idiot and moron. Let's look together at another primary source to observe, or maybe even scrutinize, its contextual eugenical normality. Here's a 1924 Virginia law relevant to our topic today. Chapter 46b tells us about some of the procedural expectations for sexual sterilization of medical patients, referred to here as inmates. Section 1095H reads that whenever the superintendent of a handful of credible medical institutions shall be of opinion that it is for the best interest of the patients and of society, such superintendent is hereby authorized to perform the operation of sterilization on any such patient afflicted with hereditary forms of insanity that are recurring, idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, or epilepsy. The language in both of our primary sources really shows what I mean about how normal eugenical sterilization was. Neither of these sources read as tonally malicious, but instead very businesslike in a cold, heartless kind of a way. Once we reached the 1940s, 32 US states had active sterilization laws, similar to the one we just looked at. It's here that we reach our turning point in this timeline. If you're a history nerd, you'll remember by this time we've reached World War II, and the Nazi death camps are already up and running by now. Thankfully, knowing of the atrocities taking place in World War II unto the German Jewry, due to American Jews and sympathizers lobbying and holding public rallies and demonstrations, caused a shift in the American public opinion on what was once seen as a widely accepted, even progressive notion of removing these so-called feeble-minded from society. Why? Because US eugenics began sounding a lot like Nazi policies. However, by this time, the damage was already done. In clear language, the open practice of sterilization through a eugenics agenda within America directly influenced Nazi Germany in its pursuit of racial hygiene, especially California, which had, by the 1930s, performed upwards of 20,000 sterilizations. This is where the connection between the United States and the Holocaust becomes unmistakable. Listen carefully. The state legislation that permitted the forced sterilization of whoever was deemed unfit for decent society in the United States inspired the 1933 Nazi law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, which mandated the forced sterilization of men, women, and children with physical and/or mental disabilities and illnesses. Unsurprisingly, this law also supported the sterilization of allegedly inferior ethnic groups, such as black people, mixed-race people, often called Rhineland bastards, Jews, and Roma, more commonly referred to as gypsies. The 8-1 Supreme Court ruling in Buck v. Bell only furthered Nazi confidence in creating a racially pure society, free of the undesirables. The Supreme Court ruling validated the Nazi urges. In fact, Justice Holmes' famous language, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, was directly quoted in Nazi legal text, and high-ranking Nazi officials cited both Buck v. Bell and U.S. sterilization laws as a rather strong defense when prosecuted during the Nuremberg trials just after the war. This type of Nazi hypocrisy defense reminds us of Adolf Hitler's acknowledgement of 4-time gold medalist Jesse Owens versus President Roosevelt's lack thereof, and the common Nazi response to American criticism during the war, essentially saying, "You cannot criticize us, look at how you treat your own black citizens." Not only had America provided a playbook for the Nazis regarding genocide, but it also provided a strong defense. Finally, the research performed and literature published by the Carnegie Institution mentioned earlier gave Nazi scientists a head start on their own racial sciences. More specifically, the Carnegie Institution funded the Eugenics Record Office to perform such research and publish said literature that would eventually influence both U.S. law and Supreme Court decision-making. The superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office? Harry Laughlin, the same man who wrote the 1922 Model Eugenical Sterilization Laws we looked at earlier, which in practice served as a template for any governing body, science facility, or university, either foreign or domestic, to adopt their own eugenics plan. Indeed, it was the Carnegie Institution that framed racial purity as a science, perpetuated the notion of race hygiene, and funded the Eugenics Record Office to allow Laughlin both the resources and platform to, in simple language, inspire Nazi ideas of sterilization rooted in legislation. In fact, Laughlin's work was so influential to Nazi Germany that in 1936 he was awarded an honorary doctorate degree by the University of Heidelberg for his contributions to racial hygiene science. Looking at this all together, the United States was of direct aid to the Holocaust by funding its most influential institute to frame eugenics as a legitimate science, create and enforce state legislation permitting forced eugenics-based sterilization as a blueprint for Nazi Germany's laws, then embolden such laws and actions in both nations by carrying out thousands of sterilizations while delivering a landslide decision in the highest court on American soil upholding said laws, and with all that in mind, still managed to provide Nazi Germany, of all places, with a strong defense rooted in the hypocrisy of its critic,